Hello friends, welcome to the series Issues in World History 20th Century, and today we will talk about modernity. Modernity and tradition, they are in a way seen together in that sense that over a period of time what happens that the things which are considered to be of modernity over a period of time, they also become tradition. So in that sense they are not contradictory or competing concepts, rather they represent the different faces of the meaning and how they are symbiotically related to each other. And we have to see that how tradition and modernity, both they are also very important from the cultural point of view, because many of the things which are part of modernity, they are part of the culture, and how many times we find that the trends or the ideas which are considered to be modern, they become over a period of time, they become traditional in nature. And we also have to say that we may point out that it stands tradition has to be qualified, which is it is to say that it could be a local tradition or an all society tradition. And there are very different strands to thinking on tradition. There are very many different interpretations as well. And when we talk about tradition, we find that it is live in nature and it is a very important factor in many cultures. And we find that the tradition could be the tradition of food and the edibles, tradition of music and dance, then scriptural tradition, then artistic tradition, then martial arts tradition, sociological tradition, tradition and attire. So we can have different kinds of things in the framework of tradition, and it relates to our day-to-day concerns, whether they are in the framework of food and edibles, whether they are in the framework of arts, music and dance, and whether it is in the framework of the artistic creations in which one is involved. And we can find that both these concepts, tradition and modernity, they do not exist in isolation of each other, but how they are related to each other in that sense. And we find that these terms and these concepts and the kind of processes which exist, and they exist and they function dialogically as well. So we find that how modernity, generally it is generally seen in an economic force in a way, while tradition is fundamentally cultural and social. But we find that when over a period of time this modernity becomes tradition, then we find that that cultural aspect is also connected to it. So we have to understand them in that sense, that how they are connected to each other and how they are reflected in the cultural traits of our society as well. So we find that tradition is a series of attitudes, language, music, art, scholarship and so on, which have been developing since ages past, and over passage of time we find that how the tradition becomes more or less entrenched in the body politic, and we have even traditional law and scriptures in any case are an aspect of tradition. So we find that how our attitudes are the kind of language which we speak, then music and arts, and how they develop and grow over a period of time, and how they are also entrenched in the body politic as well, and how these things, how they are related to the traditional laws and scriptures and etc., which are there in the society. And when you talk about tradition, when you talk about modernity, how they are important to the individual in society, that question is also there. And this is also because of the fact that it provides continuity to the social process, and we find that it garners creative and improvisational and transmits these traditions to forthcoming generations of the members of a given society. And in this way they are in a way trying to assure the survival of the society itself. So we find that how tradition is also very important in that context from the point of view of the individuals as well as the society. And when you talk about the continuity of the social process, how it is also linked to that aspect, and we find that how the various generations which are forthcoming generations, those who are part of that society, and we find that this kind of a survival of those traditions which are there in the society is also an important factor. So we find that it is in a way a repository of the survival mechanisms without which a society would fail to cohere. And because these traditions, they are being followed from one generation to another, and things which are modern in that sense, maybe in the earlier part of the 20th century, they become tradition over a period of time, and things which are modern now, they will over a period of time become the part of tradition as well. So we find that how, when you talk about that, how tradition is a repository of survival mechanisms with which the society is connected, and the society would not be able to, in a way, able to function when we don't have traditions, and it would in a way break up, and we will find that it would also be disoriented in that sense. And when we talk about the various kinds of traditions, we find that in India as well, we have different kind of traditions, and how these kinds of traditions, whether they are from music, whether they are from other arts, whether painting for example, and we see that different, especially in music we find gharanas, and in paintings we find the different schools of painting, whether they are from the Kangrai school or Bundi school, etc. These kinds of paintings, they are there, and these kinds of arts, they have specific kinds of traditions which are linked. For example, classical music, if one is talking about, then one is talking about the various gharanas, or one is talking about the various kinds of groupings, and how each of these has a lineage which is comprising the singers who had commenced or inaugurated the gharanas, and all those who have passed their talent down line, producing maestros who would take over charge once older musicians went on into the retirement. So we find that the specific characteristics of that particular gharana are being learnt by the newcomers, and then they pass on those characteristics to the others, those who are learning from this particular kind of a gharana, and these characteristics are generally unique to them, and how they learn from one generation to another, and then they pass on these characteristics from one generation to another, that also happens as well. And similar is the case in the context of the paintings, where we find that different kinds of characteristics, they are there in different school, and different schools they follow that kind of a pattern which is there. So we find when one is talking about tradition, we in a way talk about the lifestyle, that how one lives, and that is also part of the culture as well, because culture is also a way of life in that sense, that how we in a way are living in the society. And we find that when one is involved in learning various kinds of art forms, whether in the framework of drama, music, and this training itself is a very rigid kind of a training, and within the confines of the tradition, which often passes by vote and repetition of the movement, notes or other exercises that any particular training may require. So we find that these kinds of characteristics which are there in that particular tradition or that particular gharana, they are being imparted to others, and they are within the confines as well, because the rules are rigid from that point of view. And when you talk about music, for example, or dance for that matter, so there are series of do's and don'ts, that what is to be done in one particular kind of a style, whether you talk about Kathak or Kuchipudi for that matter, and what are the don'ts as well, that what one need not do when one is learning that particular dance form. So we find that how in a way tradition refers to a body of knowledge that has a structured inventory of actions, because we find that how a particular art form, the way it is being structured, how it is standardized, and the new learners, they have to learn them through this kind of a structure. And also not only actions but ideology that comprise its legitimate domain. So when you talk about ideology, then the kind of ideas which are associated with that particular maybe dance form or maybe music gharana or any other form of art. So we cannot dissociate the kind of ideas or ideologies which are associated with that. One has to also take into account that particular factor as well. And when one is talking about music in framework of India, we find that in India especially we find the North Indian classical music and the South Indian classical music as well. So some kind of a division on the North Indian classical music and South Indian classical music is also there, and the kind of nuances which are there, the kind of characteristics which are there to this kind of a music, they are also very clearly marked. And we find that apart from this kind of a division, we can have numerous subdivisions and so on, because in that sense we find that apart from this there are other practitioners, those who have evolved some kind of subdivisions as well, and these subdivisions are also having their own particular characteristics. So it is therefore a misnomer to treat concept of tradition as a term that covers everything in society and culture. So in that sense, when we talk about the concept of tradition as a term, so it has also been argued by some that it is some kind of a misnomer, that tradition would cover everything, society and culture. And it has also been argued that the tradition of music is very strong in India, and but we also have to ask questions that what type of music tradition it is referring to, because there are so many dimensions, there are so many categories and subcategories which are mentioned in those music traditions as well. And when you talk about tradition, then we also talk about it in a way encompasses and embodies a particular process or legacy, because one has to learn the characteristics or the kind of processes which are involved and the legacy of the people, those who are attached with that particular kind of traditions. When we also talk about sub traditions, from which field from which it requires contributions can be made. So we also see that sub traditions are also there apart from the traditions, and we also have to take into account when one is talking about tradition, that how the kind of historical aspect is attached to that particular tradition, whether it is scripted, it is written in some form, or it is oral in nature. And we also talk about that how a certain concept of supernatural is also there in that particular kind of a tradition, because the tradition may have this kind of a notion which is attached to it. And when one is talking about tradition, we also talk about the economic structure of the sustenance as well, that how that particular kind of a tradition it is going to sustain in the long run. And when one is also talking about these kinds of traditions, we also talk about the aspects of the indigenous art as well, that how indigenous art is also very important, because when you talk about the tradition, when you talk about the kind of culture, then it is very society specific, and how society learns new kinds of ideas over a period of time, and how these ideas which can be seen in the framework of modernity, at one point of time they may also become tradition. So when you talk about tradition, how it embodies the facts of architecture, because how tradition is also linked, for example, the various kinds of architectural heritage which is available in India, that will be part of the tradition as well. And the kind of literary work which is written in the framework of the scholarship in all areas of social concern, that is also seen in that particular framework. And how the scholars, academicians, they are also talking about the various aspects, how they are showing the social concern which is there in the society. So that is also one of the important aspect And when one is talking about literature, so this literature is also related to the scriptures, our ancient scriptures, how they are also part of the traditions, and the later writings in the framework of literature, how they are also contributing in that sense. And another important aspect which is linked is the technological structures. Technological structures are also very important in the framework, that how technology changes over a period of time and one technology gives place to another. So, we find that this kind of an idea is also very important to tradition as well. And when you talk about the kind of military for the self defense or offense, then over a period of time we find that the military culture, for that matter, or the military traditions of one particular area or region or maybe particular community, they are also being talked about. So, in that sense, when we try to understand tradition, we find that it is a type of structure and ideology that has a past, because the tradition is dwelling on the past, and it in a way charges over time to absorb the developments in that field. So, in that sense, we find that how it is dynamic in nature, it changes also over a period of time, because the kind of changes which are happening, the developments which are happening, so that that can be done. And we also see that how it also recreates and expand itself, because we find that tradition, many a time, if a particular kind of a tradition is there, some new kinds of traditions, they also come up, they recreate themselves in a manner, they also change over a period of time. So, we see that how it has a tendency to become entropic and inward looking as well sometimes, and this is true of many local level traditions which are there in a very in a specific area, and sub traditions are stamped out, that how over a period of time we find that some of the sub traditions they go on their own and they disappear without leaving much of a trace, because those kinds of traditions, they are no longer being followed in that particular society. So, the pertinent question here is, why does tradition disappear, change, ameliorate, or attempt to coexist with modernity? So, when tradition is changing, when it is also disappearing, how it is in a way making some kind of an improvement, and how it is also coexisting with modernity as well. So, we have to in a way understand this kind of an idea, that how the vectors or the chief characteristics of a tradition are themselves set to develop, change, or become stagnant. So, the tradition is in a way many sub traditions, and it is these that often linger on indefinitely in the various geophysical territories within a specific culture area. And as I told you earlier as well, that how culture is a dynamic kind of a thing. In the similar manner, tradition is also dynamic in nature, and it also records the accretive changes as well. And in that sense, we find that how the kind of changes which are happening in the society, social changes, they are the part of the process of the society as well. And it is also clear that beyond a point, tradition is not able to deal with a new set of situation and new institutions as well. And we have to see that when tradition, when they change over a period of time, when they are being accepted in the society for a longer for a very long period of time, then they become part of culture as well. And we find that at this point, if society is not to become archaic in that sense, it will require that traditions, they change, they improve, and then they try to change as well. Yet a tradition can only follow its ontology and find itself as inadequate in face of modernity. So, we see that how the forces of modernity, they tend to choke the tradition, or at least make it relatively insignificant and even innocuous as well. But however, we find that how the tradition, though it becomes quiescent, it is not really banished by modernity, because modernity is evidenced only in advanced countries of West and in metropolitan of the East. So, we have to see that how modernity, which is the part or in a way related to the tradition, and how the kind of things which are found in the framework of the modern aspects, they also change over a period of time. And when we it becomes also in a way clear when we compare the architecture of north and south. For example, a luxury hotel in a metropolitan of a developing country is virtually no different than that of an advanced country. Thus, the tradition is never really banished, but is pushed back as forces of modernity take root. So, we can in a way compare the kind of architecture which is there in the different regions, or when we see that how a luxury hotel in one part, which is a metropolitan part, is not different when you see it in a developed country or a developing country, because the kind of amenities which are there, which are to be provided to the people, those who are living here, that they have to be in a way reflective of that particular luxury which is to be provided to the consumers or the customers. And when one is talking about modernity, one sees that how some aspects of modernity, they also include the emergence of the nation state and nationhood, and industrialization and capitalism, how they are also linked, the idea of democracy, increasing influence of science and technology, and the phenomena of urbanization and the expansion of the mass media. So, all these kinds of aspects they are seen in the framework of modernity. And when one is talking about the nation state and the nationhood, then one is also talking in the framework of modernity, because these ideas, they are also seen in the framework of the modern states. And we also see that when one is talking about the modern times, then the ideas of industrialization and capitalism, they took root during the modern period, and many of the aspects of modernity they also became entrenched in the society during the period when the industrialization or industrial revolution was taking place, and capitalism was also in a way making some kind of a headway. And we also find that during the modern period, we talk about the ideas of democracy, which is some kind of a modern construct, but it does not mean that democracy did not exist earlier as well. It also existed earlier as well. And when you talk about the earlier traditions during the ancient period in India, the idea of republic which was there during the ancient times, so we find that these kinds of ideas of democracy they were also being talked about. And then when you talk about the influence of science and technology, we find that how science and technology also plays an important role, because many of the innovations which take place in art, in science and technology, they are very relevant in that sense, and how they are also vehicles of modernity as well. And we find that modern means of communications, etc., railways for that matter, or the coming of the aircrafts, all of them, they have been seen in the framework of the aspects of modernity. And apart from that, we also see that so many developments, they have taken place in the military technology as well. So, that is also considered within the framework of the modern the traditions which are connected to modernity. So, we will talk about the other aspects of modernity in our next lecture. Thank you very much.